Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the talk for tonight with a very interesting title, How Much More Can We Discover? I think it is an important subject for all of us who have an interest in pursuing knowledge. And also, I guess, also reflecting on the meaning of life. How much more can we discover? I'm very honored to have this chance to introduce to you Sir James Mirrlees, although I think lots of you are fans of Sir James. So I think he needs no long introduction. So I would just say a few things. For me, as a member of Morningside College, and I guess also for the Morningsiders here, Sir James always makes us happy because we gather together 3 times per week for our communal dinner. So we'll be seated at the table with all this food and the smell in the air. And so your appetite will be, you work out your appetite with all this nice smell in the air and all this nice company, but you won't start your meal until Sir James very gracefully and elegantly walks onto the stage and strike the gong, artfully. And for us colleagues at the Office of University General Education, Sir James is also a very happy sight to us because we all remember with very fond memory the last time he came to the General Education Student Seminar, and he was so supportive of the students who won an award there, and he was also supportive of us. He arrived early, as he always does, and he actually stayed through the whole session of Cantonese presentations. Because I would only say that in addition to being a very good economist with achievements so great that he won a Nobel Prize, he is also a very good and dedicated educator. And so I guess it's for this reason he promised to take up this important task of being master of a new college, one of the smallest, but I would say the coziest and I would say the most successful because I'm a Morningsider. So he take up this very important task, and I guess so far Morningsiders have all been very happy to be in the college. And so the episode I just related was just one small episode to show how much he is concerned for his students. And I guess Morningsiders who are here tonight, you are doing just the right thing to repay Sir James for being such a caring educator. So you come to support his talk. And of course, I know lots of you come not only for supporting, for moral support, but also to learn something important and to join in this common pursuit, thinking through this problem, very important question for all of us, how much more can we discover? So I will now pass the floor to Sir James.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming at what for me is a rather unconventional time for giving a lecture. So it seemed only appropriate to have a rather unconventional subject. A subject where you may well wonder, even if the question seems interesting, whether the answer could possibly be interesting and whether it's got an answer. Well, we wait and see. I wanted to start by telling you 3 different things that kind of motivate me here or illustrate what's going on. The first thing is that in recent years I have seen a lot of reports of Chinese politicians and governors of cities and things like that, mayors, saying it's terribly important now that China should encourage innovation. that they've been growing on the basis of the technologies available from the already rich countries. And now it is time that they produce their own innovations, because otherwise they're not going to be able to continue growing. And that certainly raises an interesting question, how successfully they could do that. Now, I'm not going to talk about that question directly, but I think it might be in your minds while I'm going on. Second, this is just something that happened to me and presumably a few other people last year. I got an email, and amongst all the other emails one gets, from some Nobel Prize winners in Europe who wanted me to sign up to a statement which was to go to the European Union in Brussels and say that it was terribly important that they shouldn't, now in the midst of all the cuts that are going on, cut back on expenditure in science. And my first thought was, yes, I might very well do that, although perhaps it's really for a scientist to do it. But then I read the piece, which is well written, but it seemed to me there wasn't a single argument in the letter that was to go to the EU that was actually in favor of an expansion of expenditure on science. So I began to think, well, what could one say? I know it sounds a bit strange to say there were no arguments, but I wasn't going to take time to prove it to you. But of course, I was looking at it as an economist in a way, thinking if you argue in favor of spending money on something, well, 2 points. One is you've got to be able to show what kind of benefits will follow. And I don't necessarily mean economic benefits, but I mean you've got to provide some evidence that something would follow. And secondly, it has to be about what would happen if you spend more. Now you see, that immediately raises the question, and it may very well be the case that scientists are doing a great deal and it's very worthwhile and has proved to be very important and probably will still continue to prove to be very important. But maybe if you had a few more scientists working, that wouldn't add to the pace of the advance of knowledge at all. And I got a bit curious to know whether it was possible to say anything about that. My third little anecdote is more of an anecdote, and this was just from a conference I was at the end of last week, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which happened to hold its 4th annual conference in Hong Kong. And I'm on the advisory board of that institute, and I rather believe in what it's trying to do. One of the things it does is that it's willing to let people outside economics propose to do some research in economics. And one of them was there. We had a session, in fact, on research and development. In fact, therefore, rather on the sort of topic I'm talking about. And one of the people was not an economist at all. He was a physicist, rather a distinguished physicist, an Italian physicist, Luciano Pietranero. And he started his remarks by saying, well, amongst other things, he said that he'd found that economists proved to be very interested in what he was saying and so on. He found a good welcome from economists, which I thought was very nice, that we were prepared to listen to people from other subjects, which we should, because a lot of the big contributions in economics have come from people who are not economists. But he explained, however, why he was now doing the economics of inventions. Because he said he'd spent quite a lot of time in recent years working on particularly superconductivity, which is an important area in physics. And he said there really hasn't been any significant advance for about 10 years. And he didn't quite know, there wasn't anything very exciting to do. He didn't use the phrase, but he was clearly saying he was banging his head against a brick wall. Mind you, I looked him up and I find he's already published 400 papers, so don't get the impression that he's been sitting around idly, not doing anything. But I thought that was an interesting remark, and it's not the only time that I've heard scientists suggest that there's been a stoppage. Of course, many of you have probably heard the very commonly said statement that pharmaceutical companies have not recently managed to make any really significant advance in the development of new drugs, perhaps not for over 10 years. Well, I'm beginning to suggest, you see, some sort of pessimism in the world out there, and on a very long-run view as to what the prospects for science are. But at the same time, another very striking feature of the world is that there are more and more scientists. The number of scientists is going up very rapidly. There are various ways you can measure what's going on, and I wasn't able, in the time I took on the issue, to discover quite how many scientists there are in the world and how it compares with how many there were, say, 10 years ago, but I'm sure it has grown very rapidly. But certainly the number of patents reported on a worldwide basis has gone up very rapidly, at about 10% a year for a while now, and has reached around 2 million. The figure I saw was for 2011, and it hadn't quite made the 2 million, but that's quite a lot of patents in a year, which patents granted. So in other words, they are new ideas that are agreed by some suitable authority to be new ideas. And of course, those of you who are engaged in research at all are very well aware of the enormous flood of publications in any area, so that it's certainly quite impossible for me to think of keeping up with all of the papers and things I'm interested in, which is partly my fault for being interested in too many things, but it's also the other people's fault for writing too much. And there's an awful lot of this going on. And of course there has been rapidly increasing expenditure on research and development. It's a bit surprising in the Western economies, and it has hit Hong Kong a bit. Growth fell off rather badly recently, and currently very low indeed in Europe, say. But they have in fact kept the expenditure in research and development almost up. So that's staying quite high. So my question is, how long can it go on? I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how research actually happens. Now, of course, I know that maybe almost none of you are mathematicians, but a number of you will do mathematics as part of your work, one way and another. And I'm sure you can get some kind of sense of what might be involved in doing research in mathematics. Of course, the reason I take mathematics as an example to think about in thinking about how knowledge progresses is that, in a certain sense, that's extremely simple, because you can say what mathematics consists of. It consists of a lot of symbols written on paper, some of which are letters standing for variables of one kind and another, and some of which are operators that add them together, multiply them, or whatever. So you're getting a lot of patterns of things, and discoveries in mathematics can quite often be represented by writing down such a series of symbols and asserting it as a truth, a logically correct, deduced statement. And if you think of it like that, then it would appear at the simplest that the process of doing research in mathematics is going to be following the rules of deduction to take some of these statements and deduce other statements, which will, of course, on the whole, get more and more complicated, longer and longer. That you may hide the length of these, for example, algebraic formulae by saying, let A be equal to B plus C, or whatever it might be, and then just A appears in the formula, but truly the underlying complication keeps increasing. And on the face of it, you would think that that makes it, well, two things. One is that if you're going to advance the subject, then presumably you better know what has already been deduced. Because what you're going to do is to deduce other truths from truths that are already known. Of course, you might deduce truths from truths that are known to you, but they might already be known, so you're not really adding to knowledge if that's what you do. So therefore it is quite important to know what has already been established. And since the whole corpus of known mathematical truths keeps increasing in any reasonable sense, then it's going to take any individual longer to find out what is already known. There's going to be at least one quite obvious consequence of that researchers are going to have to specialize more and more. And another, maybe not quite so obvious consequence is that they are presumably going to have to find ways of cooperating more effectively than they have tended to do in the past. And you can see all of that in various ways. I was quite surprised when long ago as a maths student, just at the point when I was about to give up doing graduate maths to do graduate economics, that I went to a World Congress of Mathematicians and chatting to some of the people there, discovered that I wouldn't say that they couldn't understand much more than I could, but they could understand very few of the lectures that were being given. Being mathematicians were on the whole quite honest and people, they assured me that they didn't understand. There was no false modesty about this, although I wouldn't have been able to search. So that's one consequence. But the other aspect that you've got more, you're going to have people working together. Now, you may know that in mathematics, there haven't been a lot of jointly produced papers. It's not like these papers you get in physics, which have hundreds of names attached to the paper, like when an announcement that probably the Higgs boson has been identified and its properties found.
Just feel the mic is separate.
Okay. Now, I'm not going to be pursuing particularly the idea that you're going to have a lot more joint work, but you do get more joint papers now than you used to. When Hardy and Littlewood in Trinity College, Cambridge, was an unusual phenomenon of two mathematicians working together. Although I understand that they spoke to one another rather seldom. Get it right? Oh, good. Okay, nods from the back. This is very important. I'm, insofar as I'll follow this along, I just say that the main point is that deduction is bound to get more complex. You get longer formulae. That surely is quite an important feature. But look at something entirely different. Development of the steam engine. which is a sort of descendant from the Scottish Enlightenment. I like to look at this great example of an enormously important invention, the steam engine. And of course, steam engines, in a sense, had existed before James Watt got busy. And there were many further developments of steam engines after he'd finished. But he worked on this for many years. It took a long time to get one to work. And the primary question was to get it to work with sufficient efficiency for it really to be worth people spending money on these things, instead of relying on old watermills or things of that kind. And what was going on, as I understand it, was that he had to try many things. This is very much like a not terribly good mathematician trying to get new results by following all possible moves from the formulae he's got in front of him, which is indeed very like a chess player wondering which of various possible steps he would be wise to follow. So it seems to me that what James Watt was doing was very like that. And the point of all this is to say that he's trying out a lot of the moves that might be made. Of course, he can't try out every possible thing. But that's not a fully satisfactory account of what's going on. If what I've said so far was the right account of doing research in things like engineering and mathematics and all of the scientific and technological areas that you'd be interested in, then I think I would have a pretty pessimistic answer to the question that I've set initially. Because it's clear things are getting more and more complex, and it will at some point be impossible for people to handle this increased complexity. The things that can be put together in an understandable way will be solved. Or put it another way, or another aspect of it, that the time that it will take people to catch up will get longer and longer. And of course, as it gets longer and longer, people will have less and less time left in their lives. I'll come to this question of the length of life. But at least one possible model there is that you have mathematicians eventually feeling they've reached the point when they can try to do research in their 50s. And at that point they discover that the neurons won't work well enough. And that would be the end of mathematics. Of course, like other people, I have met young Russians of 14 or 15, and also some Hong Kong ones, who can do very good mathematics at that age. So we haven't got there yet. The question is, would it be like that eventually? But there's a sense that that's not entirely right. One thing is that mathematicians certainly keep inventing devices to allow more complex patterns to be handled with the same degree of simplicity. They get better notations, they find neat ways of stating theorems, and they invent new concepts. Space-time might be one that would be reasonably familiar to people, that you can just take the 3 dimensions of space and one of time all as a single entity and think about it as a whole. Though I suspect that there are going to be, at each stage, when you invent a new device like that, there are going to be fewer people who can actually handle it. So you can see there's a narrowing, possibly, of the people who could do science, could do mathematics, rather than an expansion. I think we've got these two things going on. On the one hand, for example, in China, you have more and more people being drawn into the educational system. You find the people who have the ability to do the complicated things, but the things that they're going to have to do have got more complicated. So probably the actual absolute number who can do it may not increase. There's another aspect that I can't quite get a grip on properly, that somehow it helps to have a goal towards which you're working. That's the way that most scientists would think they were doing. They don't think they're just moving step by step from where they currently are to somewhere else. They don't know where. They have a generalized notion, the direction in which they're moving. It might, in the mathematics case, that can be made very precise because you can state problems like what's the solution to a partial differential equation, and then that gives more shape to what you're doing. Similarly, James Watt certainly knew what kind of thing he wanted to get out of his inventing in a rather general way. So it's this amazing ability of human reasoning to be able to work with not very well defined things. It's common in discussions of these things amongst economists to take an example like the wheel and say you couldn't possibly have any idea what it would be possible to do once the wheel was invented, before the wheel was invented. That doesn't seem to me to be quite right, because it's you only have to go back and read Jules Verne or something, and or indeed you could go back to Leonardo da Vinci, where it's possible for people to conceive of things flying around. They don't have the details right, but they somehow can create a goal in their mind. And this appears to be a very effective method for getting over what the economists would call diminishing returns and with increased complexity, but maybe imperfect. Of course, one thing you can understand if you think of the development of knowledge as following the very simple model I've indicated, is that there are going to be an infinite number of new results possible. So that's, of course, obvious straight away, and might be the most straightforward and obvious answer to my initial question. Of course, there is no limit to new things that could be discovered, because there are unquestionably an infinite number of true statements in mathematics, and there will never be time to write them all down. I don't think that's enormously comforting, but again, I will come back to that right at the end, because it keeps getting harder. And as I was pointing out, for each individual, there's going to be less time available in achieving the mastery that's required. Of course, the kind of invention that's likely to happen is that there will be, sooner or later, there really will be ways of making people's minds, brains more efficient later in life, which would be nice, I would say. But there are other ways of doing it. I didn't want to totally abandon the thought that there are other ways of holding at bay the trouble from increased complexity in whatever it is you're trying to do. Computers have certainly helped mathematicians. In other words, you can build a machine which can do your long algebraic calculations for you. And this has certainly been used quite a lot. And you can use the computer to check very large numbers of cases, even if it's not a very complicated calculation. There's all that. Maybe I shouldn't mention this to people who are not mathematicians. There's a lot of mathematics that's dreadfully boring, because you have to check a lot of individual cases. Not everything comes out with a beautiful general argument pop. And so we can employ our new slaves, the new sort of imperialism of humans over machines, to get computers to do it for us. So this is all showing that combination of things may be an especially important feature of inventions large and small. And So if you think of recent big inventions, or what people feel to be big inventions, cell phone, internet, then these are very obviously combinations of other things, where the cell phone is just using a lot of things that were available before. Similarly, the internet is a straightforward transformation of a multi-user computer. But a lot of other inventions were not like that. I have often been a bit puzzled to understand quite why, if you look at the overall process of invention and the creation of new products, which of course is a matter of great interest to economists, how there appears to have been tremendous specialization in the creation of things. The most obvious example, but it's certainly not the only one could think of, is the movement from fire which provided heat, light, cooking, and it also frightened wild animals away. And it probably did some other things as well that I haven't bothered to think about. So just one device did all that. Of course, what happened then was that over a long period of time, you got new devices for lighting, new devices for heating, new devices for cooking, and new devices for keeping the wild animals out. So, and in fact, it's been a kind of almost continuous progress, because there was a time when light bulbs gave out quite a lot of heat. And I certainly grew up with a coal fire that gave a certain amount of light in the room as well. Nowadays, of course, central heating gives no light, no help with cooking. Oh, I did enjoy toasting crumpets on the stove in my college room in Cambridge. These pleasures have disappeared with this specialization. And it must be because to define a specialized goal helps you to get on and do the research. So actually what I find most interesting about the coming of the cell phone, the internet, and a lot of other aspects of the IT revolution is that for once we seem to have a move away from that specialization. But I suspect that's just for the time being. And indeed, it's not a very unexpected combination, because you find that Star Trek was talking about it all long before it happened. So it was quite easy to see. Now, before I am going to actually show you some numbers and things. I'm actually going to try to say that there are some things we really could do on the question of how knowledge progresses. But I think it's important not to be caught up with the notion that when I do that, you feel that I'm really covering the whole range of human knowledge. Because here's a very important sphere of human knowledge that people talking about research and development never talk about. And you'll see why. I regard the arts as very important. They really make a big contribution to people's lives in various kinds of ways. So we must take that into account in thinking of the progress that new knowledge, the contribution new knowledge makes to us. Now, you think about things like painting, carving, building, music, literature. In all of these, I think it's fair to say that we want novelty. Mind you, that's something that differs a great deal from person to person. And there's usually a sense that the cutting-edge artists in whatever field want to create more novelty than most of their consumers want. But at any rate, it's an essential part of the arts that you have discovery. That's to say, creating new things. I say discovery because you're discovering that you can express things in a different way. You can convey emotions of a perhaps slightly different kind from those that have been conveyed before. You can you find sounds that are new. And these are all an essential part of doing the arts. And at the same time, and of course this doesn't need to be said in China particularly, where the artistic tradition is to try to do nearly as well as old artists did. In some curious way, the arts have not got any better for as long as the record tells us. No matter how far back you go to see examples of art, and of course there aren't very many in the Stone Age, just a few rock drawings and carvings, but the best of them are awfully good, and quite a lot of them. And as you come on later, most people find the Odyssey just as good a piece of literature as you'll get today. And of course the point of all this is that the fact that you don't want to claim that there's been progress in the arts doesn't mean that it isn't important that there should be constant new discovery and advance of knowledge. And that's different from the more material side of things, the science and technology aspect that I'm otherwise talking about. And I wanted to emphasize that before I get on to some measurement. How fast can knowledge progress? Can we measure knowledge? Well, there are some senses in which one can. What economists do is they look at productivity. We try to estimate how much output would have increased from one year to another if there had been no advances in knowledge at all. Well, you might think, how can you possibly do that? Well, it's because prices give you some serious information. The price of labor tells you approximately what contribution labor makes to output. Economists call it the marginal product. Similarly, the rate of return that people get, the rate of profit they get from investing, the rate of profit on capital, shows you the contribution that an increase in capital can make to output. So you use these things, and you can do it in a great detail, or you can do it very crudely, approximately. You use these to estimate how much growth of output there would be if there were no advance in knowledge. And then you compare that with how much growth and output actually happened, and you treat the difference as a measure of the rate of advance in knowledge. I had better tell the non-economists here that this is by no means an entirely satisfactory thing in practice. For example, there was a period of a few years in America back in the 70s when doing this exercise as well as one could came up with a negative amount of progress. And now you would think that it's impossible for the rate of knowledge accumulation to be negative. You could imagine people forgetting like mad and things deteriorating, but you don't think that that's what happened. So the measurements are definitely inaccurate. However, economists have been trying to do this more and more carefully, and I think we're getting some interesting pictures. Now, of course, there are many countries. You say, well, which countries should you do? Well, the obvious idea is that America will be on what we call the production frontier. It will be making as much use of new inventions, ideas as possible. So you would get a measure of the rate at which knowledge is advancing. And this is knowledge in a narrow sense. Now perhaps you see why I talked about the arts just now. I wanted you to realize that it didn't include anything for the advance of the arts. So you're certainly not including everything, and there's something else it's not going to include either, which I will come to afterwards. But we get something. We get an intriguing picture. What I've done here is to take something from, actually appears in several papers. This is one way that people produce so many papers. They write several papers with the same things in them. And Robert Gordon does this, but he's a very good economist, so I shouldn't complain. I need to pause for a moment so that you understand quite what's in this picture. You can see it maybe you can see it runs from 1948 to now, to 2010 actually. And I know we've got the various colored things. The green line, all three of the colored lines, red, blue, and green, start more or less together. The green line is, if I understand right, what actually happened, pretty much. Something was done in this data to avoid being fooled by the recession, which means that you don't produce all the output that you could, and therefore hides the true information. The blue line is where you would have got to if things had continued the way they'd gone from 1948 to 1973. I ought to be clear on what it is that's going on there. This is, in fact, it's the log of productivity. And when he says multi-factor productivity there, he means taking account of all the various inputs in the sense that I indicated roughly. So just interpret it as a measure of the level of knowledge. That's what we're seeing here. This is knowledge increasing. And the blue line is the way knowledge would have increased if it had continued to increase at the same rate it was increasing, 1948 to 73. Or at least that's the interpretation I would put on it, and it is also the interpretation that Robert Gordon would give. The green line is more what happened. The green line is the 1973-95 trend. So you can see that something much lower is happening, and red is the actual thing. Now it's true there is a slight improvement of actual over the trend later on, but the striking feature there is that you're then getting a much lower growth rate, and this already makes it look as though the progress of knowledge is slowing down. Is that right? Well, of course, maybe America is not going to be the frontier. Maybe it has already stopped being the frontier. It's not the richest country in output per head now. But of course, the richer ones are rather special cases, like Singapore or Qatar or Norway. So you can't quite reckon them to be in the same league. But certainly looking forward, you wouldn't expect America to be the knowledge frontier in quite the same way. Will new knowledge be generated and used elsewhere? Of course it will. Japan already produces more patents per head per year than the USA. Actually, the last figures I saw was it was producing about 3 times as many. So people haven't been giving Japan quite the credit they should for the extent to which it is now generating new knowledge rather than simply using the knowledge that it used to import in such large amounts from the West. And of course China now has as many patents, not per head of course, but as many patents as the US practically. Mind you, scientists I've talked to say they're not as good as the American patents, but we shall see what the results are. However, the key point is that the ideas are still available to the US and vice versa. There's stickiness. It may be a bit expensive to use the most up-to-date knowledge, but that's a question of who gets the benefit rather than what you would use. So really the different countries ought increasingly to be using the same technologies. But they are certainly not all advancing at the same kind of rate, but I've decided not to get into that. One possibility as to why the picture looked the way it did there in that previous slide, with this falling off. I mean, this is quite a long period, but from a very long historical view, it's not that long a period. We may be waiting just for another new big idea, like the breakthrough in computers earlier on. And these very big ideas and new advances that lead to all kinds of further consequences happen only relatively rarely, even nowadays with thousands, hundreds of thousands of scientists. The other thought, though, which goes the other way, is that the last 2 centuries have been rather exceptional. And we may be unwise to think that this exceptional period of increasingly rapid growth and increasingly rapid growth of knowledge, perhaps, are anything but exceptional. It's equally possible that we might go back to what it was in the Middle Ages, although how can I say? Well, what I want to do next is to look at beg your pardon for the spelling, but sometimes one's fingers get lazy. An encouraging example. Well, we'll see what you think. The productivity figures I was talking about don't, for example, really allow for advances in medicine or any of the things that help health particularly. And by the way, there's a lot that they leave out which goes the other way, like deterioration of the environment, which I won't try to get into now. So what about health? What can we say about that? In many ways, I think life expectancy might be one of the best indicators of human well-being. And therefore, a very good idea in trying to see how things have been going, to see how that has happened. Now, it's true that more and more money is spent on health over time as well. And it's possible that that does truly contribute to improvements in life expectancy. Of course, people know that life expectancy tends to improve. But it seems very likely that the improvement is largely due to advances in knowledge. That's not just medical knowledge. It may be that people are better at looking after themselves. That you would expect this would be a big contribution from education, that people will be told about things. So it's partly the better spread of knowledge that maybe that's doing it. But we still have to say, well, why exactly did it improve and how much? Well, here again, in trying to see what's the best, you'd think take the best country as the frontier, and that's of bigger countries, Japan. Here's a detailed picture, which I got from an interesting paper by an epidemiologist, fairly recent. Sorry it's small, but it's enough. I'm going to tell you enough that will make it all vividly clear to you. Right. For the moment, concentrate on the top bits. You can see this bit going up there with yellow. That's Japan. So this is what happened to life expectancy 1970 to 2009. And for much of the time, it's a pretty straight line for both men and women. It's true Japan had a big improvement at the beginning of the period, whereas most of the other countries didn't particularly have that improvement. That's why you've got so many lines on the picture. They're for different countries. And actually, the point of the paper was in many ways to draw attention to the lower lines. You're wondering who's at the bottom, which probably most of you can't possibly read. I don't know whether, can anyone guess?
Eastern European countries and Russians.
Yes, very good. Somebody who knows this stuff, yes. The presumption is that in that case it's supposed to be alcoholism and things like that. I don't know if that... at any rate, that was certainly the view of the writer of the paper. But it's the top bit that interests me, because that's a sign of very notable progress, which I take to be advance in knowledge. But really amazingly straight lines at the top. That was actual length, life expectancy. What does it mean? Life is on average 2 months longer if you're a year younger. That's more than a day a week. It's probably more like a day and a half a week. It's been going on for a while. Your children should live 5 years longer than you. And probably you'll live at least 5 years longer, on average, than your parents. But how long will it go on? Well, I thought, that paper didn't go back beyond the 70s. So I wanted to see, so I just looked up the USA. Life expectancy of about 50 in 1910, 67 in 1960, 78, 2010. That's averaging men and women this time, of course. Now that's two 50-year periods, so you can see it was a 17-year increase in the first 50-year period and an 11-year increase in the second 50-year period. Suppose it goes on like that. Okay, 17, 11, what's the next number in the sequence? How about 5? It gets you to 0 or below 50 years after that. So actually on that basis, it would be perfectly reasonable to, it's probably the most reasonable prediction from all of this, is to say that in 2060, things will peak. It might be impossible to get any further advances. Under 85, it's probably rather less than most people who've looked into this expect. Well, it's a pretty weak basis on which to make any projection. But it's kind of hard to avoid. Of course, I presume that by then Russia will be much transformed, and Eastern Europe. But at the frontier, I think, even here, the evidence seems to be towards a slowdown. So why do I really think progress in knowledge might stall? It seems to me as though knowledge can continue to progress. And the only reasonable claim, and of course it's only one possibility amongst many, is that it'll progress more and more slowly on average. However, that wouldn't mean that it stalled. That wouldn't mean that it stopped. So this is where the gloomy economist comes in. Says, well, I suppose research is costly. It's back to that anecdote I started with about the letter from European Nobel scientists asking for more money. So they wanted money in order to do research. So it would then be, at some stage, if progress gets slow enough, no matter how you value the progress, and I'm not saying, oh, you've got to look at just economic value alone. Maybe what you're really interested in is still things like whether there are intelligent beings on planets out in outer space. It's entirely conceivable, you see, that if progress gets slower and slower, that you reach a point where it doesn't pay to go on. It appears to be very likely to happen in physics because it's getting more and more expensive to try each further energy level, although there have been some ingenious ways of getting around it. I do expect that some people will still be curious and prepared to do research for nothing. And that seems to me the hope for continuing the progress of knowledge. I would happily continue doing research for nothing. So there we are. Thank you very much. Questions? Let's see. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Sir James, for giving us a very, very exciting talk. We have been talking about promoting more conversation between the two General Education Foundation courses, which are entitled In Dialogue with Nature and In Dialogue with Humanity. And this is certainly one of the talks that promote that kind of dialogue, because well, just now when I introduced Sir James, I was too focused on some anecdotes, but some of you may not be aware, before Sir James became an economist, he was actually a mathematician. So just now we have really look at the measurement of knowledge, or the progress of knowledge, so to speak, from the point of view of science as well as the arts. And as somebody in the arts, I was most impressed with your observation about how we cannot measure development in the arts by looking at progress, but how while we should not talk about progress, we still expect new discoveries to go on, particularly for students who have taken a course in Dialogue with Humanity. I guess your heart was, jumped with delight when Sir James mentioned that the Odyssey, though from so many years ago, may still be equally good, and I would say even better than any piece of literature today. But still, we believe there is development, new discoveries in the arts. So I was just kind of wrapping up ideas that Sir James proposed just now. So now the floor is open to all. Do you have any questions for Sir James? Yeah.
A question that has bothered me for a very long time. You mentioned the example of mathematics, and I want to ask how you think about humanities and social sciences in general. Because when I was undergraduate, doing the PPE degree, we had to read a lot of stuff from 17th century or 19th century Greek thinkers like John Stuart Mill or René Descartes, the French philosopher. And their books we had to study. Of course, as undergraduate students, we were lazy So sometimes we study second-hand material, papers published by modern scholars on their books, on their thoughts, usually criticism. And those journal publications, those papers, usually contain a long list of citations at the end. The interesting thing I find out at that time, which I still do not understand today, is that why is it that people could publish so many things with footnotes, whereas the original things that they criticize or that they look into usually are books without footnotes at all. I remember I came across this book by Rousseau on social contract, and that's a book without not much footnote. There's some references inside the book which I didn't understand about examples in Greek or in Roman times. And then I wonder, probably in those days, in Greek and Roman times, people did not write books or papers with any footnotes at all, because there's nothing earlier that they could refer to, right? So I wonder, the question is this kind of footnote culture signifying that we are actually making less progress these days, because we are only regurgitating on things that have been produced in the past? I have to say economics is perhaps different, because we didn't have to do a lot of reading in Keynes or Adam Smith's. Rather, we read those modern journal papers, a few of which I guess are published by you, Information Asymmetry. Actually, we read maybe third-hand materials, commentary on your papers. Anyway, the point I wish to make is this, so I don't understand. Does this show that actually, because human affairs pretty much remain the same, therefore we're not making a great deal of progress or what you said, improvement in these arts or humanities and social sciences subjects? And secondly, is it also because the footnote culture itself that is stifling progress? Because in the days of Descartes, he didn't have to spend all his time making up footnotes. Therefore, he could really just sit next to fireplace and just thought, with his thought, came up with all those new ideas, just like out of nothing, and with all those things like the Cartesian geometry and things like that, when he was actually looking on the wall. So that's actually quite a frustration to me as a humanities student. Yeah, thank you.
That's a very interesting observation. I was just thinking how another of the Enlightenment period, Gibbon, was very famous for his footnotes and decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But of course, then I realized that's because he was writing about the Roman Empire, so he had to refer to the authors of that period. So at a rather mundane level, that's part of the answer to what you're saying. Some things were starting new, and some of it is that Rousseau was probably not the kind of chap to mention it if he got some ideas from somewhere else. At least nobody seemed to like him very much, so I suppose. But then I was, I don't know, this is, I think it's probably a good idea to use it. I don't, can you hear? Okay.
It's okay.
Right. I was indeed contemplating exactly this situation today when I was looking at some economics papers in this area, because certainly the number of papers referred to has gone up quite a lot. Of course, the major reason for that is that you really do have to give credit to other people. or offend them. And it's difficult to do this completely. The problem of plagiarism is more and more troubling. And this is partly a defense. It's partly to stop yourself from plagiarizing unconsciously. That it's all part of the academic principle that you have to show whatever you got from somewhere else. But I am uneasily, for me this is a very genuine trade-off that you referred to. On the one hand, I could spend a lot of time reading what people have written about something I'm thinking about. Or I could think about it myself. Like many economists, I think I tend to think, if I couldn't have thought of it myself, then it's probably wrong. I mean, I don't intend to be boastful about that. On the contrary, it's rather that I think in terms of basic ideas, economics is not so hard that you think you're going to find somebody, an economist, with some argument that you completely hadn't thought of. It happens from time to time, but I think so that means you could do it either way. You probably wouldn't lose anything in terms of advancing knowledge if you were to just think it out yourself. As far as the theoretical as part of the subject goes. But of course the empirical side matters a lot. To get tables that then it does genuinely save time to find the pictures that other people have created and the tables that they've put together, rather than always to put them together yourself from the basis. But it was the former you were really interested in. And I was just reflecting, I've read a number of Oxford philosophers, and I didn't think they had an awful lot of references, most of them. So, yes, Austin didn't, or Ryle. But they do refer a bit, but it's not like scientific papers or economics papers with, or a historian's work. So I think you raise a very interesting problem that people have, where increasingly you have to pay attention to other people's work, because otherwise you will offend them and the academy generally, rather than because you need it for the advance of knowledge. When I talked as though you always need to go and find out what everybody else has done. I think that was an exaggeration.
I think that was certainly a very good question, and you won a big applause from lots of young faces here, because I and my colleagues are coercing them into making references and using footnotes. But I would say that in the case of Descartes or a lot of those thinkers, would it be right to put it this way, that they are actually conversing directly to previous thinkers? But whereas when we are writing papers, we are not conversing with previous thinkers. We don't expect them to read our papers, but we are actually having a conversation with each other. So that would probably be making a difference.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Sir James, I would like to ask a question. How do you think about capitalism? And as we know, the environment and the carrying capacity of the earth is finite. And how much more GDP growth can we still afford? And how much, within a limited system, let's say the planet Earth, how much economic growth, which is, as some economists may say, this is unlimited, how much can we to sustain this kind of development? Thank you.
Now, what I probably didn't emphasize sufficiently is one thing is clear: there's an awful lot still to be found out. And one of the things that I think is extremely hard to get any handle on is just how far we can get making much less use of damaging resources. I'm thinking of oil particularly, although it's not the only example of something with very, very bad effects. For the time being, we can keep growing fine using it. It's not that there's any serious shortage of these things. Understanding the physics and chemistry of these things, we've got all this energy coming in from the sun all the time. So it's not that there's ever going to be a shortage of energy that we need for all the kinds of things. But it's clear that a world that operates using only green sources of power will look very different from the world that we're in now. Though I really don't see, in the largest sense, much reason not to think that that could also be a world with a very much higher GDP than the one we have. I mean, for example, even now photovoltaic cells, which admittedly use other kinds of material which will eventually be in short supply, are beginning to be much cheaper to operate. That still might mean that we have to spend our nights sleeping because there's no electricity available until daylight comes. But I think there are lots of possibilities for green development, but equally I think we're a long way from it. You did start by saying, how about capitalism? Which has a hint in it that maybe the capitalist institutions and property ownership and the kinds of interests that they create, I mean that the particular economic and therefore political interests of the owners of these resources may prevent exactly the kinds of technological development that would be needed. And if so, that could indeed lead, probably on a time horizon of about 100 years, to real problems. And I'm not even prepared to say that I think that's unlikely. But I certainly think capitalism can survive.
Professor Mirrlees, I have a question regarding the possibility of new development or growth. You mentioned quite a number of areas, say like art and and iPhone and all the others. But and also you mentioned we have right now 2 million types of patents. But then the problem is, if the problem is in the application. I think we think about the applications. There should be a lot of area that we can develop. Say for example, I remember when I was young. Now I'm retired. When I was young, people tell me don't go to the sunset industry. So I asked them what sunset industry. They said it's textile. But now, textile, they have, you look at this textile industry, they are still surviving. And more new machine, new technology, coating, it's coming. So the point is the application of technology on sunset industries. And then we'll make the industry become sunrise. So and you mentioned about combination. So if we combine the knowledge, not to develop new theory, but to develop new application, then, just imagine mathematics, a combination of, C n to the power, or P n to the power x, then the n is 2 million, then how many permutation will it be? That is, how many possibility will it be?
Right enough. Part of the point of mentioning the 2 million is that it must make you wonder where have they all gone, as it were. I mean, it obviously wasn't as high as that. It suggests that, I suppose 7 years ago there would have been 1 million. So, I mean, the sheer number of patents that have been registered by now is unbelievably large. And yet, if we were to sit down and make a kind of account of the inventions we were aware of, it'd be quite a long list, but it wouldn't be remotely of that order of magnitude, which is, and I think one has to conclude, and there are lots of examples to support it, that most inventions are of no value. However, interesting point about sunset industries. I think that this whole issue of how technical progress goes on in different industries is indeed very interesting, and people have done a lot on that. And you get very, very different rates of advance in the different industries. This is perhaps most clear in the energy industries, where apparently, according to what people are supposed to be expert in this field, that coal has not got any more efficient. Been no technical advance there for a long time. Although, of course, coal remains the cheapest energy source, unfortunately. But whereas oil was advancing quite significantly for a while, and then you've got these some of the new technologies doing very well. Of course, nuclear power not improving. So you just get big differences, and it seems to me that the big differences between the ones that are doing rapidly and the ones that aren't going anywhere in terms of new advances doesn't seem to be particularly to do with sunset, sunrise, newly fashioned things like IT, or very old things like rice. You have the possibilities of advance anywhere, which I think is part of what you're saying. But I think it's also very striking when you look at the data that in a lot of industries there is practically no advance. But also in a lot of industries there is practically no research. I mean, practically no patents. Just as in a lot of countries there's practically no invention. I mean, in Greece there's very few patents per year. So, which is strange after. They did it all back in the classical times, I suppose. It's kind of hard to understand why things are so concentrated, but they really are. It's the most striking feature of research and advance of knowledge, how it's concentrated geographically and in particular industries very narrowly.
Yes, James, I want to ask a question about the potential new discoveries in economics. Recently, I read an article written by the famous economist, Professor Justin Eve Lin. And in that article, he said that when he returned to China after receiving his PhD in the University of Chicago, he tried to apply the Western economic theories to explain the economic situations in China at that time. But very soon he found out that the so-called mainstream theories could not explain many of the economic phenomena in China. So he went on to develop his new theories. But when he developed his own theories, the fundamental approach he used is basically that of the mainstream economics. So it seems to me that the economic theories may have two parts. The first one is can be called a general theory or the general principles that can be applicable globally all over the world, more or less. But the second part is the specific theory that is developed to explain the economic situations of particular countries or regions. So my question is, what would the new discoveries in the science of economics would lie more on the part of the general theory or in the part of the specific theory? Thank you.
Yes, it seems to me that Justin Lin goes rather, or Lin Yifu, depending how you wish to put it, went too far in that direction, perhaps because one always tends to overvalue one's own account. But of course, there was the particular feature, even at the time when he came back to China. I don't actually remember quite when it was.
About 1985, I would say.
Yes. So the economic reform period had been going on for a little while. You'd think that the obvious difficulty of applying existing economic theory, the general principles, to China would be that if they weren't using prices, like in the period of up to 1977-8, where you really didn't have markets cleared with supply and demand equal to one another. I didn't mean one couldn't do a lot using the ideas of economics, particularly macroeconomics. And I think looking back on it now, one can understand a lot of what's going on without getting into the price mechanism. But Chicago was an economic school that concentrated very much on prices. Took very little interest, at least up to that time, in important things like income distribution or other motivations, or the nature of what kinds of incentives encourage people to produce more, which turned out to be tremendously important in China. And yet, when I say that, I'm also aware that another former Chicago economist, who was a professor in Hong Kong, Stephen Chung, wrote papers where incentive contracts of the kind you get with sharecropping, which can very well be understood as the way in which Chinese farmers were operating once by 1985. That was, it seems to me, to be using economic ideas absolutely centrally. But it's true there was originality there. It's also the kind of thing I'm interested in. It's not like the first term economic theory that most people seem to think of when they talk about economics, but it's still central economic theory. So I would need to see in more detail quite what he's claiming. But I do think it's an overstatement. I think it's the general principles apply pretty easily to the Chinese system. But that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of important features, just as there are in Britain or America or whatever, which are not encompassed in these general things, because you get particular individuals behaving in ways, I mean, like finance ministers or businessmen who have particular economic interests they wish to pursue that lead to things that you would say shouldn't happen under the standard economic model. All that's true, but I think thinking about it is still economics, of course.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Mirrlees. I'm a little bit greedy. I want two questions. One has to do with our day-to-day life, the connectivity to internet. How do you think the internet, the information that we can access through internet, help or impair our access to knowledge? And another question I want to have is that when you talk about the arts, advancement in the art, what does that mean? How would you kind of maybe illustrate how the so-called advancement in art will help us to kind of acquire more knowledge. I just try to see how I can understand that better.
On the first one, of course, it's probably clear. I got these pictures of the data off the internet. So the internet is a wonderful research tool. It's another thing, quite separate from the use of computers, say, to help what you're doing, which provides a kind of amplification. And I dare say you could say, because you also asked, then how could it hinder the advance of knowledge? In a sense, it has to be the same answer I'd attempt on the problem of all that stuff out there that's written and is relevant. The internet, unfortunately, makes it a lot easier to find everything that has been written on a particular problem. And that is, I'm myself not a particularly fast reader, but I'm not a fast reader. Even for a fast reader, I think on almost any interesting topic, there's going to be too much to read. And how can you find out which bits of that you really needed to know? Well, many subjects have done a pretty good job of doing physics abstracts of the medical profession. I still find pursuing some things I'm curious about. Let me take an example. I don't know whether the internet hinders here or not, or what's going on. But it seemed to me clearly a very important bit of knowledge that needs advanced is finding out what various treatments in traditional Chinese medicine, how they actually perform on large samples, well constructed people, analogous to finding out what's the effect of drug, particular pharmaceuticals on people. And it seems to me surprisingly difficult to find any such studies, say, of the effect of acupuncture that then turn out to be of the right statistical quality. Now, they must exist. So I'm curious to know why doesn't one get at them? And I think one of the things is that apparently in that whole sphere, insofar as people are trying to advance knowledge in the area of traditional Chinese medicine, it's as though like drug manufacturers in the West, they don't want to publish everything that is found. So maybe I'm just saying that there are problems that the internet isn't going to solve rather than problems that the internet creates. But it still relies on the willingness of people to put things on it. It's not something we can easily control as far as I can see. And there are attempts now to get similar evidence in the West always available on the internet. But there are clearly interests that go the other way. Sorry, but it was... and your second question, remind me? Yes. That could go on a long time. It might have been rhetorical. Let's say you might have been saying, yeah, but of course it doesn't make any sense to think of progress in the arts. Oh, but I think it does, because I really do believe in the quality of pieces of art. So of course my claim was not that we can't talk about progress here, and I can easily imagine things getting better. Of course, one of the things that happens is that presumably a lot of dud art disappeared. Nobody was interested in preserving it. And possibly lost, well, I know we lost some good stuff too. There's some Monteverdi operas that have gone for good. But then there's a lot of dud stuff around now, isn't there? So, I mean, it really does look as though you don't have that overall progress. And equally, I wasn't complaining about that. Because we're very fortunate that there's so many wonderful pieces of art have been created in all of these dimensions, so that it is actually hard to conceive of anything better than the best of them. But it's hard to, I mean, there's so much that it would be nice to get rid of. And again, a little bit about all that stuff out there on the web, which is really worth reading. Same kind of thing. But it raises a different issue here. That what for me is art I could do without, which is most pop music. I equally recognize that there are many people for whom that's much more valuable than the kinds of music I like. And I'm not opposed to that. And I think that's a very special feature of the arts, which is not, of course, true of mathematics.
Hello, Professor Mirrlees. I have a few questions for you. First of all, one thing you alluded to in the course of this lecture was the communication between the disciplines, despite the advent of the internet. In my experience, from reading the citations and stuff on the internet and whatnot, it's that in spite of certain degrees of overlap, the communication between them is still very poor. What do you propose to help remedy this? And second, when you were drafting this lecture and presentation, did you think about including any insights from, say, the philosophy of science or the history of science? Thank you.
In a sense, this should be about history of science, but I don't know enough about the history of science. That's the answer to your writer at the end. Like almost everybody else, I've read Kuhn, which is fascinating, but that doesn't tell. It didn't seem so. The only things I knew about. Some of the stuff at LSE and so on didn't seem to me to say anything on this topic, but maybe it should. Interesting comment you make. Because it's almost taken for granted that more multidisciplinary work must be a good idea, more communication between fields, more work together. Yet many people have maybe some people have the impression that a lot of deliberately multidisciplinary work is not actually very good. And years ago, when we were first talking about these kinds of issues, which are very important in economics, because economics impinges on, needs a lot of cooperation with other fields. But generally speaking, we don't find that very easy. And I remember a conversation with an economist, Jacques Drez, whom I admire greatly, who'd be one of the leading European economists. He remarked that in his view, joint multidisciplinary work only works if people share the language of mathematics. And at that time, it seemed very difficult for us to think up any examples where that contradicted that. I mean, for example, economists nowadays have quite a lot of interaction with psychologists and with the psychology literature. So there's mathematics in a rather general sense. It's when things can be quantified and when you turn things into equations and so on. So it works there. But I'm aware that, of course, there have been some very big advances which happened after that conversation, or just after. I think in genetics and all that, where the interface between biology and the molecular sciences, chemistry at the time, was very, very important, and that people had to get away from the narrow separation of the subjects. So I think that is an area where interdisciplinary work seems to have proved to be enormously fruitful and effective. But still, my narrow experience in economics is that it's difficult. And one of the major reasons why it's difficult is that so often people seem to lack respect for the work people are doing in other subjects. Perhaps economists, and it may be only right that it should be so, are particularly subject to that. Because it seems that a lot of people, scientists particularly, do believe that if only they had the time, they could clearly do economics a lot better than economists can. And somehow that's not a good basis for cooperation. They're welcome to try. And I did remark early in the lecture that it so happens that a number of major advances in economics have been made by non-economists. So I would even encourage them to try. But I think you need a lot of mutual respect when actually to cooperate effectively.
Hello, Sir James. Thank you for your lecture. And regarding your last statement of some people may do research for nothing, well, it reminds me of mathematics books that I read, come across many years ago. And in the preface of that book, well, it refers mathematicians to some people who merely enjoys the process of thinking. And well, they may not be solving some problems. They may be just create some mathematical objects. They define the mathematical operations, and then they may be rigorously deduce the theorems and corollaries. And they put all these on the papers. And maybe after, say, 200 years later, and scientists of another discipline, maybe the say finance or maybe biology, maybe. Well, they may meet a problem in their own aspects, and then they will look into the encyclopedia, and they may look from nowadays backward, and maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when they go to 200 years ago, maybe they say, this equation is solved my problems nowadays. So maybe mathematics are some science that the effects may not be shown on the society very quickly. The saying of 200 years may be a little bit exaggerated. Some mathematical advance, like the game theory, the game theory of John Nash, and they first published this as some mathematical theory, and the people found its application quickly and awarded him the Nobel Prize of Economics. And so maybe for some science of the more fundamental, say mathematics or maybe physics or astronomy, maybe there is advancement. But if we apply your model of the growth of productivity, maybe it cannot reflect the advance very promptly. Do you agree with this?
Yeah. I don't expect the rough model that I kind of put there to work terribly well, I'm afraid. But it can certainly be improved. There are many examples, of course, of people in related subjects finding the what mathematicians had done very useful, although they might or might not have developed it with an eye to economics. The game theory example is a very interesting one, because of course Nash was not the first to develop game theory. It was Johann von Neumann, and he was participating in a seminar with economists, mathematical economists, in I suppose Vienna probably. And he wrote a couple of papers, one of which was more obviously about economics than the one on two-person games. That was something that all mathematical economists at least knew back in the mid-50s before Nash did his work. Indeed, it so happens that when I was a maths student at Edinburgh, we were expected in our final year to do a lecture about something. So I actually did it on von Neumann's game theory. So it was something mathematicians were very aware of as well. But so I know that von Neumann was doing all this with an eye on economics. So it wasn't just something that had been done independently. And Nash, similarly, what Nash had done was no doubt to look at von Neumann's work and to say, wouldn't it be interesting to generalize it? And so that's pretty much what he was doing. So again, it was clearly Nash doing economics, although at that time most economists would have said that had nothing to do with economics, but it turned out it was just what they needed for all kinds of things. And my impression in the main, that's how things go. But the obvious example would be, this sounds a little technical, but you get the idea. Einstein trying to develop the theory of general relativity. Couldn't do it. He was in need of a mathematical language to talk about it. And he found that something called tensor calculus had already been developed in mathematics without much of an idea of this. At least this is the account as I've heard it. But of course it had, although this goes back to Riemann really, although we didn't talk about tensors, that there wasn't that much of a gap between the development of these things. And they were developed with an eye on space, even if not thinking about it. On the whole, I would expect that's the way it would go. Mathematicians can give you a number of examples of a lot of the development of prime numbers, of course, turned out to be of use in cryptology and in encoding messages to be secret. And that's perhaps the major example of how things can happen totally independently. But in a way, this is part an answer to a supplement to what I said about the previous question. But I should say also that for cooperation, people really do need to be interested in one another's topics. Not just fields, but quite narrowly. They've got to understand what one another is doing. Now that's in economics. I know it's obviously not true in particle physics, where some people can understand how to make things, to do the measurements, and other people can do quantum theory, and there it seems to be possible to have a bigger division.
Maybe one last question.
So James, thank you for your inspiring talk. I noticed that you mainly mentioned science in the Western tradition, but it may be a good idea to learn from the East, like dealing with the uncertainty problem. Another example is that we think we live in a three-dimensional world in Newton's time and a four-dimensional world in Einstein's time. And now scientists say that we are actually living in a 11-dimensional world. But I think someday we may meet the Buddha's wisdom that we are actually living in an infinite dimensional world. So, do you think our cultural value may have some essential effect on the development of knowledge? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, indeed, you could ask that question about whether, say, religious or cultural beliefs have an influence on Western developments. Examples don't spring to my mind immediately. I mean, I thought yours is an interesting one, since it somehow seems much more appealing that there should be an infinite number of dimensions all rolled up smaller and smaller, rather than that you stop at 11. And that just seems attractive. But I have, insofar as I'm a scientist rather than on the arts side, which I think is quite a lot, I've often expressed this by saying, well, you see, what people in the arts don't understand, if you talk about a theory to them or a piece of science, they want to know what made you think that, or how will it influence people. And the scientists just want to know whether it's true and what else it might lead to. And so in some ways I think that there are reasons why culture is not all that likely to influence science, but it's perfectly legitimate to ask and explore these questions, which you could certainly do within Chinese culture as well, because there have been a lot of inventions developed in China. And since people have been very fascinated for a long time with the puzzle as to why China's, I think it must be fairly spectacular growth at one time just stopped. So that when Adam Smith was writing his Wealth of Nations, he said China had reached the stationary state. And essentially the reason was because it didn't have the conditions of the West, and he claimed that once it had the sort of political and legal arrangements of the West, that then it could grow again, which has turned out to be true. But you might not accept that that's a good description of what happened. But I do think communism is a very Western kind of thing.
Well, thank you very much again, Professor Sir James. And if there's anything we can do to contribute the cultivation of respect for people doing other disciplines, I think conversations like this would certainly be among them. And this is the last of the series of talks for this term on intellectual pursuits in our lives. And today we have a social scientist reflecting on the pursuit of knowledge and how knowledge can progress, or not progress, but still, continue to develop new perspectives. Actually, in the last few talks, we also have the perspectives similar reflections, from a scientist and also from somebody who has done years of research in literature. So you are welcome to go online, and if you weren't here the last few weeks, you are welcome to go online and review those video recording, and thereby maybe together we will cultivate this mutual respect for what each other is doing and maybe contribute to the development of knowledge in the future. So again, thank you very much, Professor Sir James Mirrlees. Good night, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for the occasion.
Thank you very much.